Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm here with part two of the off-season projection special with Ben Gretch. If you missed episode one, suggest checking that out, especially the first 10 minutes or so where Ben and I kind of outline what the series is going to be about. But we did the AFC East. Today's episode, we're going to do the NFC East. As a reminder, you can find all my work over at Establish the Run. All the projections that we're talking about are done by myself, Mark Dankenbring, Jack Miller, and the ETR team, and they flow through to our rankings for all our sites, including Underdog, whose ADP will be referenced throughout the show. Also, make sure you're following Ben at Yards Per Gretch on Twitter. Can also check out his Substack, bengretch.substack.com. That's a great resource all season long. I'll say, especially in season for the Stealing Signals column. Must read each week to just stay up to date on usage and what signals to buy and kind of what could be noise and you can ignore. Ben, thanks so much for joining me here for part two.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back. Part one was fun. This is a fun division. The East divisions have been kind of boring the last several years, and they got more exciting last year. They're both fun now. The NFC East, lots to think about here.
Yeah, it is fun, and I feel like the past couple of years, I always have some hot takes mixed in here and there. I feel like this year I'm struggling to come up with as many, but there are at least some teams that are fun to talk about, even if you're not super hot takey. Dallas is fun to talk about, where you're just trying to figure out what they're going to do. They ditched Kellen Moore, which just objectively seems like a bad move. Moore was very fast paced. He was an aggressive guy. Their offense was good with him. Seems like McCarthy wants to go more old school, and as a result, you got to figure out what to do with their play calling. They brought in Brian Schottenheimer, who's can we classify him as a boomer? I think pretty safely.
Yeah.
Pretty safely classified as a boomer. But what is that actually going to entail? And Dallas is one of the fastest paced teams previous seasons. And it's kind of remarkable, Ben and the ETR team, we have really similar projection inputs on the Dallas play calling, even though that involves a decent amount of guesswork. So last season, Dallas ran 65.5 plays per game. They're at 67.8 2 seasons ago, really high. But we've got them at 64.5, which is a little bit above average. I would say there might be some room for downside, just, with the coordinator change there. We each have them at exactly 58% called pass rate, which again, that one's tough. I think they're going to be good again too, is the issue. So even last year, they were -6% PROE. They had a 54% pass rate overall, and the defense was good last year, which was huge. The year before that, they threw a bit more. So I could see where they maybe are even a little bit more boring than we're projecting here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely possible. It's you look at their past data. I mean, we have them throwing a little bit more, but we've both scaled back their play volume. They've been notoriously fast the last several years. But it's funny how close we land, and it's kind of just indicative of the whole idea of regression, and we're sort of moving back towards the mean. But this is what happens with projections. It's also one of the pitfalls of projections where yeah, I mean, if you're thinking through it, you're probably thinking through it similarly to other people who are thinking through it, where it's yeah, we're going to regress this back toward the mean. We're going to still have them a little bit above average. But like you said, there's room to be way off on this still. They could be a really boring offense. It could be completely different. It's just hard to project.
I'm a little bit concerned about Dak's true ceiling, just kind of relating this back to specific actual fantasy stuff. I think he's probably going to have a really solid season because I think he's good. He's efficient. The receivers are good enough. They play in a dome. I think he'll be fine. I don't know if the true ceiling is really high, just because he might be hamstrung a bit by the play calling, especially if the team's actually, good again. If the defense is good and McCarthy doesn't seem like he wants to press it. Maybe they were pretty aggressive under Moore in all circumstances. So that's some of my concerns. We've got him, between 43 to 4,400 yards, 28 to 29 touchdowns, about 230-ish rush yards with a few rushing touchdowns. We're really similar overall. That puts my projections at 304 4-point per passing touchdown fantasy points on the season. You've got him at 320, which I know for us, that stat line has him at QB 13, his ADP's QB 12. I'm kind of, if I've got CeeDee Lamb or Cooks early, I'll take some Dak. I really don't take Dak without those guys because I haven't, found him to be a guy that I want to backdoor stack too much. I mean, you do have Gallup late, but kind of mad on Dak this year.
Yeah, I agree with all that. The two things I want to highlight first is rush TDs. Had 6 each of his first 3 seasons, had 3 the next 2. And that 5th one was the year that he hurt himself, big major leg injury. He had 3 through the first 5 games, but hurt his leg. So his rush TD rate over those first 4.5 seasons was really strong. The 2 seasons since he came back from that leg injury, only 1 rush TD both seasons. They've basically treated him a little bit different around the line, around the goal line. They're not using his size to get some of those rush TDs anymore. It's interesting to think about if he has rush TD upside. We both have him around 3 rush TDs. Was Zeke gone, especially because it was, a big part of Zeke last year was, he had double-digit touchdowns and a lot of them were from 1 yard. I think it was like 8 touchdowns from 1 yard or something. I don't have the exact number right in front of me, but I looked it up when I did these projections, and it's just crazy. Zeke was top 3, I know, in attempts from the 1 yard line and TDs from the 1 yard line, and also top 3 in attempts from inside the 5 and touchdowns from inside the 5. So got a lot of work in close. If some of that touchdown work, I mean, obviously some of it could shift to Pollard, the other running backs, but if some of it could shift back to Dak, who's a big-bodied quarterback, that could help some of his upside. The other side of it, I would say, is, I mean, look, they lost Amari Cooper a couple years ago. They lose Dalton Schultz this past offseason. We don't really know what's going to happen at tight end. Michael Gallup, a lot of people are interested in, second year removed from an ACL, wasn't very good last year. I'll just point out that his last really good year and like the peripherals per route stuff was 2019. He wasn't very good in 2020. He wasn't very good in 2021 before the injury. We had a almost 1,000 route sample across those 2 years before the ACL that he wasn't good. He wasn't good last year. So if you're hoping 2 years removed, he's back to what? I mean, he didn't look great those 2 seasons before the ACL. So you go through and you do the projection. One of the things that feeds back to Dak's efficiency is he doesn't have a deep receiving core. He's going to need Brandon Cooks, the newcomer, who can be very good, obviously, but he's going to need him to be really good and quick. CeeDee Lamb, obviously a legit number 1, but what else is there if Michael Gallup isn't a star? The other, young wide receivers like Jalen Tolbert didn't step up last season at all. So there's a big question to me about where the production comes from on the other end, catching the passes, now that the pass core is a little bit thinned out after these, the loss of Cooper and Schultz the last couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. Going to running back, the tough projection for Dallas, you're projecting right now Zeke to return to Dallas. We're projecting Zeke as a free agent. I do think Dallas is the favorite to be Zeke's team for this upcoming season. So I'm with you there and how that impacts things. And I think it does impact Pollard. Right now, we have a Pollard, someone that if there was no Zeke, I'm really comfortable with him as a 2nd round pick, with his talent, with the running back room that they have. And again, I think the team should be good, even if they get a little more boomerish on play calling. That shouldn't affect Pollard too much, at least in a negative way. In some ways, might give him some more carries. You just hope the offense to be better than versus some of that bulk volume. But yeah, the big difference there is we've got about 25 to 30 more carries on Pollard than you do. Similar amount of targets. We're pretty close on the fantasy point production, and some of that is, the efficiency is generally going to be a little bit higher if your volume's not quite as high. Like we expect a little bit of an efficiency drop off if you're a full workhorse. So some of that is the reason why we're close on fantasy points, even though you've got less overall volume. And again, it speaks to the importance of getting targets in the pass game. Like you've got a few more targets, and that also helps to make up for, more than X amount of carries. So that's where we're at on Pollard. If Zeke signed there, I'm trying to think what I would do with Pollard. Like I'm really comfortable with him end of round 2, kind of depending which wide receivers are there, that 2-3 turn. But if Zeke was there, I don't think it'd be a huge impact, but you mentioned all the goal line stats on him, Ben, and like, it's possible they just do that with him again, which just kind of would suck.
Yeah, that would suck. And that's why I'm projecting him back there though, because if you look, Pollard is listed at sub 210. Malik Davis is listed at sub 210. Even Ronald Jones, who I think has put on weight over the years, but when he was coming out was weighed in sub 210. They don't have a big body. But then Deuce Vaughn's the other guy they brought in. They don't have a big bodied back. This is also part of why I was mentioning Dak's rush TD stuff and how that weighs in. They were hesitant to use Pollard on the line of scrimmage. Eden Hart has had a really great tweet that of all the backs, I think there was like 13 that had double-digit touchdowns last year. Pollard's average length of TD was the longest. I think he only had a couple that were within 10 yards. I mean, he hits on those home runs. Excuse me. But you have, they used him around the line of scrimmage, although he wasn't very effective. I remember this because I had a lot of Pollard last year, wanted him to get some of those touchdowns so that he could steal some of that work from Zeke. Zeke, however, was efficient at converting those touchdowns. It's a really small sample. I don't think Pollard's actually worse than Zeke necessarily around the goal line, but I do think the results would suggest that the Cowboys might believe that, right? Like what we care about is what the team believes. So yeah, I mean, I honestly think when you look at like the size of their backs and in their whole backfield, and you look at what Zeke did for them last year and the fact that Zeke's still sitting out there and probably not going to get a lot of interest anywhere else, like, and he still wants to play, and they're going to bring him back if they can get him at a cheap deal, right? I think they're just waiting around for Zeke to not get the deal that he's hoping for, and then they get him more cheaply. But to me, it just feels like such a logical thing. And if he comes back, he's coming back for the goal line work, right? Which would be would be a disappointing outcome for Pollard for his full season upside. I'm still really excited about Pollard. I think he would be actually more fun to draft if he started to fall into the third.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it'll be tricky.
Yeah, I think again, it wouldn't be a big drop for me if Zeke signed, but it'd be enough that would probably fall in the third for me, and I'd be happy to take him there, but probably would move him then more firmly behind like Devonta Smith, T. Higgins at that 2-3 turn, make sure I get that wide receiver first. Whereas right now, like there's some times where I'm like, on pure projection, like I get why Pollard's there. So as far as Zeke, I've been he's one of those players that we find these with the free agents where the longer they go without signing, they just fall. Like no news, people get more worried and they fall. And there's no real like upside case to Zeke, I don't think, in like a managed league setting, but in best ball, I will take him towards the end. A lot of these picks towards the end are going to be zeros. And if you do think Zeke signs with Dallas, he's probably going to have.
I wish I could make fun of that, but everything I just said means he has 10 TD upside in Dallas this year, which I mean,
you're stoked. You're stoked in round 17, or 16, even 16. Yeah, not high. You're not going to win your league with Zeke, but you might get the usable scores that you need to carry you along the way. As a result, I have not been drafting. I like very early on drafted like some Deuce Vaughn, but like I'm really not drafting any of the Dallas backups because I'm worried about Zeke signing. I'm also like kind of think the Deuce Vaughn thing was like a little bit of rookie hype for myself immediately post draft, where I'd actually think like Malik Davis might be more of the backup. They've also got Ronald Jones, who you're projecting a little bit. We've got Malik Davis above Rojo. You've got Rojo above Malik. So short way of saying I'm not really drafting any of Malik, Rojo, or Deuce at the moment until I see what happens with Zeke.
Yeah, me too. It's not a bet that I want to make in June until we see if Zeke signs. I think if we get into August and he still hasn't signed with Dallas and we're approaching preseason games, then these guys will be interesting, certainly. But for now, it's just, I'll figure out my exposure to the backup situation in Dallas later.
Yep. We'll go to wide receiver. CeeDee Lamb had a really strong year. I was a little worried about CeeDee going into last year. Like I guess for me, it was like, how good is he really? Like, let's see. Like I was a little concerned, and he had a really strong season. Showed he was capable of handling, the amount of targets that he did. What was the actual target? Do you have? I don't know if you have it in front of you, like the actual target number on CeeDee.
I don't. I have his targets per out run, which were in the 21%.
156 targets. Sorry, go ahead on the targets per out run.
Yeah, 21.1, 21.7 his first 2 years, jumped up to 25.9, which is like a really strong, anything up over 25% at, a solid ADOT like he has. I mean, that was a big jump. We talked a little bit about him last year as having sort of a path similar to Cooper Kupp's breakout year. Obviously wasn't going to hit Cooper Kupp's ceiling, but could rise in targets per route run, could also rise in routes, which he also did. And he's a very efficient player and has the potential at any given year, I think, to have a really strong efficiency season. When Kupp really broke out, he hadn't been a full routes guy yet. He hit that peak of routes that year. His targets per route run also rose, and he had an efficiency peak and just had the greatest receiver season ever. Not that that was ever really in the outcomes for Lamb, but I mention on this because that is a smaller version of that is what Lamb did last year. He did rise both the overall route volume and the targets per route run, and continued to be efficient for the third straight year. And after the target efficiency, yards per target, touchdown rate, those things. So, I mean, he looks like a legit star now. I mean, he's a guy that I think has the ability in any given year with this type of profile to put up a season that does compete with the very elites, the Jeffersons and the Chases.
Yeah, I think the only slight concern I have is not with CeeDee Lamb, who, again, all those upside cases you said, like, I was worried about them coming together at the same time, and they did. The routes plus the targets per route run. He's shown us that. Now it's like, now we got to worry about the coordinator change. And like in terms of huge, because you're talking about a guy that's going to end of round 1. So it's not like I'm not afraid to take him there. But as far as can he get to that next level, that's sort of the question mark is, will the play calling be enough to provide him the opportunity? And if it's not, does he get even higher in terms of overall target share? It's not a super deep team, so it's possible that he does do that. So I think Lamb's ranked, I have him ranked kind of appropriately. I think we're like one spot positionally behind him. That's because we'll have a fun podcast when we get to the AFC West, and I can profess my Davante Adams love once again. But that's the only reason, that's the kind of deviation from the market that bumps him down for us. But yeah, super, not a whole lot more to add, just really solid selection. Behind that, you've got Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup. You hit on some concerns with Gallup. I think Cooks is like a pretty solid pick where he's going right now, but he is, this is what his 10th year in the league will be, his age 30 season. He's been a lot more durable than I think he gets credit for, just because there's been some kind of like, big hits associated with him when he's left, but he's played 12 games or more every single year since his rookie year. So 8 straight seasons of that. And, last year was a tough situation in Houston, where Houston was just so bad and they couldn't move him. And he was kind of quiet quitting for parts. So, it's tough. It's tough to parse, like, is this a dude aging and falling off, or like, was it just a really bad situation last year? And now he's on a team that is way better than he was last year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be in on him, but what I said earlier about the Gallup stuff, I mean, if you go look, one of the really fascinating things about this team, last year, their number 4 receiver had 10 targets in target volume, and that was T.Y. Hilton, who only played 3 games late in the year. They signed him very late. Jalen Tolbert made no impact. Simi Fehoko made no impact. Kavonte Turbin wasn't really used in a gadget role or whatever, but he was their return guy. It was CeeDee Lamb, Noah Brown, and Michael Gallup. And Michael Gallup wasn't good, and Brown, frankly, wasn't really either. But they stayed full-time throughout all season. They just kept playing the same 3 receiver core. I think you're going to see that again. I mean, I don't think you can really be super optimistic about Tolbert or about Fehoko or those other guys when they couldn't really crack last year, a group that didn't have much in the number 2 and number 3 spots. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's a very big positive for Lamb, really consolidating things. And then it's, Cooks or Gallup, they're both going to run a lot of routes. And I was talking about some concerns about Gallup. I think the door's really open for Cooks if he still got it. And I don't think, his yards per route run still fine last year. You mentioned kind of quiet quitting. Wasn't as good as his 2021 season at all. But also, like, not massively worse than, the rest of his career. Mm-hmm. His efficiency was down, certainly a little bit. His routes were down because they kind of just didn't play him a ton at times because he just wasn't happy to be there. If he comes out in Dallas, he's ready to be there. He's been effective most of the spots throughout his career. He's been efficient. If he still has that in the tank, like, I think he's got plenty of room to be the second option on this. Like, there's going to be a lot of volume there for him to get it. He's not competing with a lot of people outside of Lamb that are going to keep him from having a strong year. I'm not, again, wanting to be super in on an old receiver, but I do, I can see the case for Cooks. Absolutely.
I get like a little, I mean, it's not, there are a lot of clear differences, but I get, in terms of how the market feels about wanting to draft him, I get a little bit of like Tyler Lockett vibes from last year, where it's like, all right, if you guys are just going to keep ignoring him, at a certain point, I'm just going to take like these targets that are going to be there. And then like, maybe you just run into like a better season than you expect, which is kind of what happened with Tyler Lockett. Was like, well, we had way more systemic concerns about Seattle in general. So that was part of why he fell. But there was also part of like, oh, he's just boring. Like, let's take somebody else. And it's very easy to feel that way about Cooks. Like, let's take Quentin Johnston at that point. Let's take George Pickens. Like, these are the guys that he's going around.
For sure.
Yeah, and then even Gallup, like with the concerns, as you said though, Ben, like these guys have to run routes. So even him going off at like wide receiver 58 on Underdog right now is like fine, even if you think he stinks, because like is just no. I mean, it's just ugly behind them. Like T.Y. Hilton, to your point, like he was a boost to that team, which is just outrageous.
It's outrageous. But again, the issue with Gallup, 2020, 1.34 yards per out run, 2021, 1.37. I mean, middling targets per out run both years, middling yards per target. Just wasn't very good those last couple of years. And then last year was even worse at 1.00 yards per out run coming back from that ACL. So, but again, go back to 2019, he was a 2.16 yards per out run guy. Anything over 2 is very strong. He does have a 2.0 plus yards per out run season in his career. His targets per out run and his efficiency, both sides of it were career highs that year. It's just we're several years removed, but I'm with you at that price because he's going to run enough routes. He doesn't need to be that guy from 2019. He needs to at least be, a little bit better, I think, than 2020, 2021, but it's probably possible. And the same stuff I was just saying about Cooks, the opportunity that's there, it's there for Gallup too.
Yeah. So as fun as Dallas is to talk about, like a lot of it's kind of like, we feel great about Lamb where he's going, but like the market does seem like to have these guys priced somewhat appropriately. Like they're fine. You can definitely draft them at their price tags. Tight end is where I've been a little bit below market. I feel like I just haven't landed on much Jake Ferguson or Luke Schoonmaker late. I know some people had takes there. It does seem like Schoonmaker had some hype early in the offseason, and now it feels like it's going to be Ferguson's job. Admittedly, I don't have a lot to say about Ferguson. I guess the question is, does he step into Dalton Schultz's role, or was Dalton Schultz like actually good, so he earned that role? And part of that impacts, our feelings too about these wide receivers having to, this wouldn't affect their routes per se, but it might affect their targets per out run, depending on how much goes to the tight end position.
The consolidation of the routes that I was talking about at wide receiver, I mean, if that I think it's possible that could be a team level thing. They want to have a guy that's in these roles. And so if somebody wins a tight end job here, it could be viable, right? And I think Ferguson and Peyton Hendershot both had about 100 routes last year. Ferguson was more efficient, earned more volume on his routes as well. So both sides of the yards per out run equation was stronger than Hendershot. That's why he's getting more of the incumbents. He's the one that's kind of getting looked at more, I think, than Schoonmaker. I'm willing to take a few stabs on Ferguson as a result of that. His targets per out run, very small sample, but was solid. It was, I think, up over 20%, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, I mean, I'm willing to take a couple stabs on him. Schoonmaker, if you look at his college profile, was a guy who didn't really do anything until his final season. He projects more like a really strong athlete, but more of a project at tight end. One of those guys that would probably fit into the mold of, rookie tight ends don't produce a lot in year one. So Ferguson's the guy that I'm kind of willing to take the swing on for that reason. If somebody can consolidate, it's probably going to be him in my mind. But it's tough. I mean, it could be split. We don't really know how they're going to operate.
Let's go to the Giants. I know last year, Ben, we really leaned in on the uncertainty here, and we're in on the Giants. And it was a mixed bag in terms of results. Like Danny Dimes was a top 10 fantasy quarterback. Barkley kind of quietly got there, but they didn't throw as much as we had hoped. Part of that was they just had disasters at wide receiver, not just in terms of talent, but like they couldn't even get consistency out of the little talent that they did have. Eventually, towards the end of the season, they did start to find something with Isaiah Hodgins and Slayton playing better. And we saw it in the playoff game against the Vikings, like they were willing to throw a bit more. And I'm going back to the well a little bit here. This is one of our bigger play calling discrepancies early, and it's not massive, but I have them at about one more play per game than you have them. And I've also got them at a 60.5% called pass rate. You're about 2 percentage points lower than that. So the result is I've got 2.5 more pass attempts per game for the Giants than you do.
Did you look at their rates just late as you were explaining all that and I was listening to it? I think you're making great points. When they finally got the receivers in place that were a solid trio with Richie James and Hodgins and Slayton, were they more pass heavy down the stretch? And you mentioned in the playoff game, but like, are your rates more reflective of that?
Let me look that up if you want to talk a little bit overall while I look up.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so
numbers.
One thing I want to say on the Giants while you look that up, I think they're a really interesting team. We talked about this on last year's shows. We get into some of these teams that help us explain some of the bigger picture concepts that we run into. But I think their running back room and their receiver room are really interesting in terms of things that can happen in projections. With their running backs, we don't really feel great about any of the backups to Barkley. So you get this element where you're like, you can project Barkley for so much volume if you want. Matt Breida is an aging backup. Eric Gray's a day 3 running rookie who is 205 pounds and ran a 4.62 40. He's like Gary Brightwell level talent is what it looks like from an athleticism standpoint. He's got a little bit more of a track record as a receiver, but they don't look like they have anyone as a backup that can really compete with Barkley. So you're like, okay, I can consolidate so much volume to Barkley, but that can be a little bit of fool's gold when you're doing a projection. And then the receiver room's the opposite. There's so many names here and we'll get into it, but you have like the 5th and 6th and 7th guy that you want to give some volume to. And then, I mean, you can't really give anyone a strong target share. I couldn't get anyone even approaching a 20% target share. That doesn't mean that's not possible, though. Some of these guys are probably going to get cut. The routes are probably going to consolidate to some degree. So, like, it's interesting to think about whether the projections play a little bit of a trick on you there, where the depth and the fact that you want to project stuff to the 5th and 6th receiver isn't really the way that the season can play out. Because, like, if you look at their season in spurts, especially late in the year last year, they did consolidate. Like Hodgins and Richard James and those guys, they were like viable plays in the playoff contest because we knew they were going to run the routes at those stages of the season. So they're an interesting case study. They're 2 positional groups, both ends of the spectrum. Did you find that stat?
Yeah. So if we draw the line in the sand, like Isaiah Hodgins got his first start week 11 against Detroit. It was his 3rd game with the team. He was inactive 2 weeks prior, played against Houston the week before. If we draw the line there, first 10 weeks of the season, the Giants had a 52.6% pass rate, average minus 8.8% PROE. From that point on, they had a 63.9% pass rate.
Oh, wow.
With a slightly positive 0.2% PROE. That includes the playoff games. So I do think that's who they want to be.
Yeah.
Well, but they also,
that was a pass rate jump of like 10 percentage points, right?
Yeah. And part of that's game script, but even on PROE, it was about a 9-point switch in PROE.
And week 11 through the playoffs, they played 2 playoff games. That's a sample of 9 games.
Yeah. So against Minnesota, their expected pass rate was low because they dominated the game, but they had an expected pass rate of 50%, and they actually had a 65% pass rate. Against the Eagles, they had an expected pass rate of 69%. They threw 67%. It seemed like they went in a shell a little bit against Philly, but it was still only minus 1.9% PROE. In context, they had they had 4 games double-digit negative PROE, a couple in the minus 20s. The start of the season where it was like they didn't have receivers. I think it probably took Dimes some time to pick up the offense, and they were like in games too. So those were the games where Barkley was kind of getting overloaded with bad volume for a while.
Yeah.
So I think there's some optimism there. It's hard, to your point, like,
I'm going to change my number. I like your numbers a lot more than mine after hearing
that. I'm in on Dimes again. I think he's going. He with all that he finished. Maybe some of his rush stuff isn't like super sustainable, but like.
So that's the thing I want to chat about. But finish your point.
Yeah, he's going off at QB 14. We have him at QB 11. Like, I still think he's one of the better bets out there. Like, I think he's got a ton of.
And you've actually really pulled his rush stuff back quite a bit, which is and you still have him pretty high, because I have him higher than you, and I know I pulled it back. His rush attempts per game last year were way up, 7.5 versus a previous career high of 5.6, and he's played multiple seasons. That was 5.6 was his previous career high, so almost 2 attempts per game higher than that. I think that kind of I mean, it was a contract year last year, right? And then they decided they want to commit to him long term. I think it's kind of interesting. What my take on him was sort of how interesting you think he might be as a mid-round QB is probably how much you buy that rush attempt bump going up. And it was both his scramble rate and his designed rush rate was up a ton. And they might still do a lot of that design stuff. I don't know. I think it was certainly a part of their offense and something they baked in. But again, like, do they try to protect him a little bit more now that they've committed to him? They've committed to him for at least 2 years, a lot of dead money into 2024. But to hear you say that, and you guys have it projected a little bit of a different way, a little bit more pass heavy. You do have his rushes pulled back even more than me, and you still have him as a value at QB 14. That's very interesting to me. We have a kind of a different outlook on their whole team. The rushing not as important if the team level stuff that you described happens.
Yeah. And you've kind of got outs too. Like, if he runs again, great. If he doesn't, but they throw more, also great. If you think he just sucks, like, it could be bad, right? Like, we went down I went down with Zach Wilson last year, where I was like, the price is good enough and the setup's good enough, and Zach Wilson just couldn't do it. So, I mean, obviously we feel better about Daniel Jones than Zach Wilson, but there's still a certain level of, like, is he actually good, right? That is important here. But yeah, I think he's got more juice than Dak in terms of upside of where it could go on their team setup. So I'm into Daniel Jones, one of my favorite QB values. Again, it's hard, like, especially if you're drafting best ball right now, where it's like off his stacking. It's like, who do you stack him with and stuff? And I don't think you have to stack him quite as heavily, because again, you still do have that rushing component. But yeah, getting to the running back spot, we were chatting a little bit ahead of time, Ben, about how it was hard not to just overload Saquon with volume, right? Like, Matt Breida was the backup last year. Looks like he's going to be the backup again this year. They do have a rookie in Eric Gray that could be there, but Barkley's just going to get a ton of work. I'm hopeful that the offense is a little bit better from the jump this year. They have less of those games where they, like, really grinded him with, like, low value touches, and he gets as many high value touches than last year. Maybe they can keep him a little bit fresher all year long. He seemed like he had a little bit more juice when they started to scale back the raw carries the second half of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful for that too. What we were talking about with the volume is just, I mean, he's going to look great in a projection, and I do think that's telling us something. Like, they're going to give him as much work as he can possibly handle. I do think there's something actionable there, and yet, assuming he doesn't hold out, we have that other little risk, right? But, like, it seems like he's probably going to play. But the concern I have a little bit on the way that projections work is, like, some of the teams that actually have a viable backup that you want to project a little volume to, suddenly Saquon just looks better in the projection because he doesn't have a backup, because the depth chart looks so thin, or, like, he doesn't have, like, a viable backup to take some percentages off his rushing workload or whatever. It's just a little bit easier. And therefore, I think I'm projecting him for, one of my highest rush attempt totals of any running back in the entire NFL, because it's just a little bit easier to push all that volume onto a player who's really good. There's not a ton of running backs that are as talented as Saquon, but it is just a little note for people who are doing their own projections. Maybe they're doing their own projections for the first time. Like, there are these situations where you wind up more optimistic in the projection. And if you stand back and think about it, it's probably more about whether or not Saquon can actually handle this many touches. I'm projecting him for, almost what do I got? Like 325 plus touches. And you guys are close to that too. I mean, it's a lot of touches.
Yeah, it is a lot of touches. And too, you got to, like, when you think about the ceiling case too, like, we kind of give people a ceiling case, like, this is what their volume could be in a ceiling case, like odds of hitting that ceiling. And sometimes with a player like Saquon, we'll actually scale back a little bit the odds of hitting the ceiling, just because we're kind of, like, baking in that, like, our base projections are already kind of there, right? Like he's, like, there's only so much more room for him to go, Yeah, it might sound counterintuitive because he's like closer to the ceiling in base, but am I lagging at all? Just it seemed like I was lagging a little bit. Just want to check with you. No, I'm good. Okay, good. Awesome. But yeah, I'm pretty into Saquon in the second round. I guess like, it comes down to like if you're scared about that like volume being just like a bit of a false signal, Ben, or if you're into Saquon, he's going.
I'm still into him. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really saying I'd be afraid to take him. He's going in the early second, right?
Yeah, he's going mid second right now. I've got him. You know, you're splitting hairs, but I've got him RB4 and the market has him RB6. So
I really like the receivers in that range. We talked a little bit about Garrett Wilson on the last show. Talked about Amon-Ra. They go a little bit higher, but they can fall sometimes. But Waddle goes in there and Olave goes in there. I find myself taking those guys more. But if they do go off the board or if I want to get a little bit of a different exposure, I have no problem taking Barkley, behind them. I'd probably take those receivers over Barkley in a vacuum.
Yeah. That's very close. I think probably I would, especially knowing how drafts are playing out right now. Whereas like if I'm in an FFPC league where I know I can still load up on wide receiver, maybe I'm taking Barkley and going hero RB there. If I'm an underdog where I'm worried that like an RB value is going to fall to me end of the third, I'd rather I think I said to you guys, like I had one where I took Barkley and ended up taking like Ridley very early in the third. So I had to go receiver. I was like, I much would have rather had Waddle and the falling running back value in the third than Barkley and Ridley. But I will take Barkley ahead of like Olave and Higgins. Is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, that's where he belongs for sure. And I agree with you on the. I'm definitely thinking underdog brain where
for sure
I can get running back value later.
I don't think there's much to say at backup running back, at least right now. I think this is a backup running back spot that if there's a clear RB2 closer to the season, we get into like peak managed league draft season. I might, I'm just stockpiling guys on my bench. But right now for best ball, I'm not drafting any other Giants running backs.
I'm not either. How are you approaching the receivers? Because there's
Yeah, we don't even have them all listed. It's a nightmare. It is a nightmare. So the receivers we have listed right now to talk about, because we just kind of our sheet set up for the primary four, because usually that's what we need. Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, Jalen Hyatt, Paris Campbell. But this team also signed Jamison Crowder, and I just saw a clip of someone being like, Sterling Shepard's back and looks great. I mean, it's outrageous.
Right. And Isaiah Hodgins is still there.
Yeah, Hodgins, who honestly I think like in the ETR people, value-wise, I think he's our favorite of the bunch. Is Isaiah Hodgins. So what we're up to 7 guys that legitimately you don't. There's 7 guys and you don't know the order.
Right. So I mean, go ahead.
I'm like. And a lot of these guys have overlapping skill sets too, right? Like like Sterling, Shepard, Wan'Dale, and Crowder. Like,
yep,
I want to be in Wan'Dale, but
I think that's the goal. I think Daboll's trying to sort of get depth at different positions, and obviously they also brought in Darren Waller this year. And I think it's possible he plays outside some this year, and it's kind of viewed. And they use Bellinger as the inline tight end on those formations, not always, but. They used 12 personnel, 25% of their first downs last year. It's a pretty solid rate. It wouldn't be that surprising to me if they were using both the tight ends together, kind of splitting out Waller as to me, him and Hodgins are similar, the ways that we were using Hodgins last year. Then they have Hyatt and Slayton as their deep threats, are both similar skill sets. And then, the guys you mentioned, Paris Campbell, Wan'Dale, Crowder, and Shepard. I mean, they're all sort of like these smaller slot receiver types. If you look at their contracts, Slayton got a way bigger deal than Shepard to come back this year. They both re-signed this offseason. Slayton got 2 years. He got a $3.5 million signing bonus. Shepard got only 1 year, no guarantees. It seems like with some of the injury stuff that they didn't have to give a lot to get Shepard to come back, and he has been making waves, but he's so much easier to release that I'm kind of thinking he won't make the team. And then Crowder's another one that's an easy cut. Paris Campbell got 1.5 mil at signing. But even if you look at those contracts, Campbell and Slayton, and buy that, it's still hard to parse with Wan'Dale and Jalen Hyatt, who are day 2 picks in the last 2 years, both on their rookie deals. The current coaching staff and GM front office picked both of these guys, and those, I mean, they're on cheap deals, rookie deals, like they're theoretically cuttable, but I don't think they want to cut them. They like Wandale and Jalen Hyatt. I think that's why they brought them in.
Yeah.
And then Hodgins, who Dable brought over from Buffalo, still on his rookie deal. And people have talked about he's very cuttable. He is from a contract perspective, but he's their best returning receiver. Maybe he was really good down the stretch last year. Him and Slayton. So it's incredibly difficult to parse.
Yeah, the way you're talking about it makes me think too, like with Shepard and Crowder, maybe they're just like, hey, let's get these guys in case Wandale's not ready for the start of the season. Coming back from the ACL, and maybe it's like when Wandale is ready, one of those guys is out. It seems unlikely they'd have all three of those guys. It just seems like a weird dynamic in the room to have all three of those guys. Right. But yeah, Wandale, I'm curious how he popped in your stuff. It seemed like he was starting to become like that really high targets per out run guy that we had hoped. And then, he had that one huge target game that maybe is being overweighted in my mind when I say that, but he's pretty cheap. Slayton's basically free. Everyone's kind of worried about him because it seemed like they didn't want him last year, and then they had to play him, and then he was good when they played him. Hyatt seems a little overvalued to me. We're just worried about him as a prospect in general, and it's not like it was the best draft capital. So I really
came out of kind of a gimmicky role and a gimmicky offense was the take. I'm not really playing Hyatt because, I mean, like, I hope I don't miss on that. I usually play the rookies for uncertainty and upside, but I guess I think he's maybe one coming from a different type of offense, might need some time to pick up the offense, might not get used, especially in managed leagues. I don't think he's probably going to see a lot of routes early. I know Levitan actually tweeted out recently and threw caveats on it that, like, look, they have a lot of receivers. That's probably why this is happening. But that there was a report that he was playing with the third team a little bit, Hyatt, which it's early in camp and they have a ton of guys. And that's probably why, like he had said, but that is the kind of thing. It was confirmation bias to me where I'm like, I do think they might bring him along a little more slowly. Especially because they just gave Slayton, like I said, the guaranteed money. And I do think those guys are probably in a similar role, especially if you think about it from an ADOT perspective. I mean, there's a lot of talk about who's the X receiver, who's the Y receiver. I think about it a lot in terms of we drop these plays, where do the depths get attacked? Because, you can have the outside receiver or the slot guy attack downfield. It's just, it would be different in different formations, but the way that they drop the plays, you do need to be able to attack different areas of the defense. The way I think about it is like, okay, when you have Slayton on the field, he's the guy that's usually attacking vertically, and it's probably the same case for Hyatt. And so I think of those guys as sort of overlapping. Waller and Hodgins, I mentioned, they're more like intermediate guys, and you have sort of like underneath guys, Campbell, Wandale, etc. You're probably not going to have like Campbell, Wandale, and Crowder all on the field at the same time because then they're all just sort of like under low ADOT.
Yeah, what are you doing?
So it doesn't make sense. So, I mean, you're probably going to get some mix of that. My biggest question is like, can these guys consolidate? Because part of me is saying late in these drafts, they're maybe worth going after because if somebody like Wandale or whoever consolidates volume, that there could be one of the few late round targets that has 100 target potential at wide receiver. Then the other side of me is going, well, are they going to just kind of rotate these guys a lot? Are they going to play a lot of these dudes? Because there are so many there. I mean, it almost feels like a low probability bet to even get the right guy right. And so should I just be avoiding Giants altogether? Because what's the point? Like, I don't know. How do you parse that?
No, I mean, that's the dynamic, and it's really difficult. I think for me, the two guys I'm most on, like Hodgins just seemed like he flashed it a little bit end of last year, and he's really cheap. So I like Hodgins at like, what's it, like 30 picks after Hyatt. Hyatt's starting to fall as like all the rookies are. He's down to like 161, but Hodgins is at 180. So it's like a 20 pick gap. Just kind of prefer Hodgins. And then Wandale intrigues me just because I think like if I want to get a better read on his health and where he's at coming back from the torn ACL. But if you felt good about his health, he's the guy I could see most emerge just getting, peppered with some targets. Cole Beasley was always great in that role for Buffalo. Could see Wandale that with a little bit more pop. So those are the two I've been targeting. Once in a while, I'll take Hyatt way after ADP. Slayton, I'm just worried that they just aren't in on Slayton, even though he has played well and does have the big playability. So sort of how I'm breaking it out, but you are right. Like, I know it's tough. I guess the benefit for wide receiver later is if these guys are at least on the field, you can get some spike weeks. Like if they're throwing more and they're a little bit better, that even if they are like 12% target share guys because they're rotating, like you could still, as long as they're playing, like you can still run into some weeks that you're using. And again, to your point, Ben, like managed league stuff, you're probably not taking a stab here, right? Like maybe Wan'Dale just in a full PPR league where like if it just breaks the right way and he's super high targets per out run. But other than that, it's tough to see like the real high end upside from Hyatt. Like he's just not going to command enough volume.
I'm with you on all those player takes. The frustrating thing is to see that Paris Campbell's been a guy that's been doing well in practice early because it's like, okay, I mean,
I hadn't even thought of Paris Campbell.
Yeah,
I was like,
there's always somebody else.
Deal with Paris Campbell. It is absurd though. So,
but Waller was interesting. He's a little bit more pricey, but I do like him. I mean, they brought him in for a reason. I mean, everyone gets brought in for a reason, but he hasn't played a ton in line the last few years. Was in the slot a lot last year. I want to pull those numbers up, but I mean, he still looks like he still has some talent. He's been a little bit banged up, but yeah, slot 62% of the time last year. And out wide at least 20% of his snaps every year of his career so far. Was only in line 17% last year. I mean, I think they'll probably have him in line a little bit more than that. It's a different offense, you know, et cetera. But I do think it could have been sort of a smart, you know, sabermetrics type of move. Like, oh, hey, wide receiver contracts are through the roof. Let's get an athletic tight end on a cheaper deal, but we'll just play him at wide receiver. Like as far as the free agent moves, they added a lot of depth all over the place at wide receiver. But part of me is thinking they're adding him as like hey, we're going to use you as a pass catcher. That's why you would add Darren Waller. And I do think he's the one that I want to be in on that could really consolidate volume.
Yeah, I think he's a decent bet too. And you know, depending on your drafts, that's also kind of a spot where wide receiver starts to get a little shakier. Like you're still in the wide receiver window, but it's, you know, you're starting to get, if you're in a wide receiver hungry room, which some of these happen, you're starting to get into guys like maybe Michael Thomas, you know, Zay Flowers, which aren't like bad picks, but you know, it's definitely a drop off from when you're taking like kind of like the Gabe Davis tier ahead, at least in my opinion. And that's where like Waller might slot in.
For sure.
Yeah. So I'm in on Waller. Let's go to Philly, who, yeah, we were excited about Philly last year. They hit in a big way. And again, this is where the projections help give us an idea on a range of outcomes. Like if you were purely drafting on projections, probably didn't have a lot of Philly, but understanding where it could go. Like we were reading the signs, Ben, that, you know, they trade for AJ Brown and looking at how the PROE had shook out the year before, this team wants to play more aggressive than it showed at the end of 2021. And they certainly did. And I think, again, we could see a jump in pass rate just because the game script is probably not likely to be as you're just going to get some regression in game script, right? Like they rolled last season. So that's good for Hurts if he's going to drop back more. They did not also make any sort of ruling against the tush push play for QB sneaks, which is, you know, hard to bake into the projections, but that's a pretty big deal as far as rushing touchdown upside for Hurts. Like he's going to get some freebie rushing touchdowns. So I think he's the QB1 overall over Allen and Mahomes. I'm really in on Hurts. We've got, from a play calling perspective, we're both around 65 plays per game. I've got them a little bit pass heavier at 58.6%. You have 57%, but we're pretty close overall, right around 32 pass attempts per game and just under 31 rush attempts per game.
And we're both regressing that from last year where, I mean, they were very healthy last year. It's one of the things that you see with teams have great seasons like they did last year. But yeah, they ran a lot of plays. Their pass rate was a little bit lower because they were leading in a lot of games. They won 14 games. So we're bringing the play volume down a little bit, pass rate up. You have brought the play volume down a little bit more than me, pass rate even higher than me. And I like that. I think your numbers are probably solid there. I didn't really know how far to move on that, but yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. They're another team very concentrated in their data from last year. I mean, they just they had only 4 receivers that got a target all season last year. 4 wide receivers, then 4 tight ends and 3 running backs.
Wild.
Yeah. That's an insane stat. You never see stuff like that. AJ Brown, Devonta Smith consolidated a ton of volume. I've long been a huge AJ Brown fan. Love him. Everything I was saying excited about CeeDee Lamb earlier, I think I would have Lamb over Brown straight up, and that's not how ADP is shaken out early, because Brown is the opposite. Where I was saying Lamb, I think, has this ability to have a season that can compete with Jefferson and Chase. Brown last year, to me, got everything he could get out of this current offense. I mean, unless Devonta Smith has a major injury where Brown gets even more, but like this is a little bit more of a run team. It's not going to be a team that's going to throw a ton. They're going to be good. They're not going to need to throw a massive amount, even though we are scaling it up again. I like Brown a lot, but I mean, again, with the point I'm trying to make with the 4 wide receivers getting a target last year is that things were very concentrated last year, about as concentrated as you can get. A lot of things can happen in an NFL season where things don't go as well as they did. Goddard missed 5 games, which is another thing that helped, the wide receivers continue to consolidate. But yeah, things went about as well as they can go in an NFL season for those guys. It's just, it feels like what they did last year is closer to the peak of the range of outcomes.
Yeah. Can definitely see that. I guess the bull case for me would be that they're just in tighter games and have to throw more, and hopefully if they stay healthy and have to throw more, you could see some higher end outcomes. I did mention, I have Hurts as a QB1 overall. In our ranks, I think we have Allen actually technically 1 slot higher. All those guys are really good. I just have an affinity for Hurts, I guess.
He's definitely in that tier now. I mean, last year in the draft season, he wasn't, obviously. I'm with you. I think he's right there. I checked when you said that. I think I have Allen slightly ahead of him in my projections too, but he's right there. He's right there.
Yeah, the running back group is interesting, right? Like Miles Sanders had a really strong fantasy season, despite getting vultured at times, despite having like almost no role in the pass game. And that's because you've got an offense that, as you said, Ben, was really healthy. They put up a bunch of points. You're playing with a mobile quarterback. That's going to help rushing efficiency. They bring in Rashad Penny, trade for DeAndre Swift. They've still got Kenny Gainwell. I mean, they've got some upside in this backfield. It's kind of tough to parse out who it's going to be. And also there's not a ton of running back targets, which, limits the upside a little bit. We ended up pretty close on Swift. You've got 136 carries. We have 121. We each have 41 targets overall. That nets out pretty close in fantasy points. You've got 157 PPR. We've got 147. As far as Penny goes, very close. Again, you've got 122 PPR points. We've got 119. We're a little higher on Gainwell overall. I think, it's tough to know. Like Gainwell, maybe he just keeps his role from last year despite these additions, and he was kind of useful at times in that role. And I kind of like him at the end of best ball drafts. But circling back to the guys Swift and Penny, I've been out on Swift despite like buying his talent in general. Another case where the price tag is slowly coming down to a point where I'm starting to get him a bit more. And yeah, I just think like at the right tag, I'm investing in the talent and an offense that has given us RB production even without the huge running back target volume. Curious what you think in terms of, can Swift demand more running back targets because he's so good at earning running back targets? Or do you think this is like that role for Philadelphia is just never going to see that many targets?
I think the key of everything you just said there is how valuable the running back production is. Miles Sanders was really good last year, but a big part of that, again, is you have a really good offensive line and you have a mobile quarterback, which you emphasized. Jalen Hurts led the NFL in design rushes last year. 123 to 89 was Justin Fields in second place, way ahead of any other quarterback. And that threat, I think, really impacts the running efficiency. They use Hurts so much in intentional running situations. The defenses have to be even more. I think there's like I'm basically making a case that there's scales to the impact that rushing quarterbacks can give to running backs. And Hurts is like at the top of that scale with Lamar Jackson, probably. The way that they use him in their running game really helps their running backs. So you want to be in on these guys collectively. How to play it is tough. I really like Penny because he's always been really efficient in Seattle, which is been a good spot for running backs. But you get an efficient running back, he's now in a really great spot for rushing efficiency. I do think at the price you're getting him at, especially in best ball when you don't have to, deal with the injuries, you're just like, anytime he pops, I get him in my lineup. That's great. Swift, I'm with you. A little bit pricier, a little bit tougher. The RB target stuff, I go back to the RPO stuff that we've alluded to. Like, I think some of the times they're throwing to their early option. Like, the thing with the RPOs is the lineman can't get downfield. So you either throw to your first read or you're giving the handoff. It's a run pass option. And I think the reason that a lot of the targets consolidate on guys like AJ Brown and Devonta Smith is because it's the RPO stuff, that the decisions they're making, the reads. It's either a run or the ball's coming out and going to that player. It's not that player and then reading out the pass play and then dumping off to the running back. That's not happening. That's happening, but not as much. They run one of the highest rates of RPOs in the league. And so that's why I think the targets consolidated the other positions. Just 11.6% of their targets went to running backs last year, and they had a really high rate of wide receiver targets, 65%. And I think that's a tough thing for Swift to change just by being DeAndre Swift. I think he's a good receiver. They'd probably like to use him in the receiving game. I do have the running back target rate coming up, but 11% is really low. I mean, you want to see like 20% running back targets to be really in on the running back receiving upside. I have it back up to like 14.5%, with Swift getting, I think, like at least half of the targets, more than half of the targets for all the running backs. But Gainwell's going to get some targets, right? I have Penny getting a dozen. Like Boston Scott could get a few. I have a hard time seeing the upside for Swift in the passing game. He can add stuff as a runner too, with all the ways that I was, just describing the rushing efficiency. So I want to take some of him, but I agree with you. He's tough at price.
Yeah, we've got him with an 8% target share. I guess if I was trying to be real bullish on Swift, it would be like, well, maybe because of his talent, he can get to 12%, which is kind of low for his skill set, but would be really high for a running back in this offense. But yeah, it's tricky. Both Swift and Penny, I see the ceiling cases. I don't know the odds of them hitting the ceiling case because they're like talented, they're dynamic players in an offense that's going to be really good. Penny, I've heard like some cut risk floated. I don't know how legit that actually is. We haven't really been buying it, but I know, it's been floated out there. I don't know. It was floated by a non-reputable beat writer. So it was like a guy who does not have good takes. But okay. I had, seen it in a couple spots. I don't think it's really that. I'm still drafting him. Like if I really thought he was going to get cut, I wouldn't be drafting him, I think like Rojo last year, like I was like, I'm not touching him in like round 11 right now, where like I'm drafting Penny around, round 11 or 12 still.
Yeah, it is just a reminder, though, not a huge investment in him this offseason. He got some guaranteed money. But then DeAndre Swift, I've heard mentioned as like, they traded a draft pick for running back, and this is a team that doesn't invest in backs. My argument there is like they traded that draft pick that's a 2025 pick, and if Swift walks this offseason, might actually be able to get a comp pick back. It'll probably be later than the pick they traded, but it might end up being like a 2025 pick swap when all is said and done. They're thinking ahead of the game, I think, a little bit there. So I don't know that they really give up a ton to get Swift either. They're just a smart team, right? They make smart moves like this.
Let's go to wide receiver. A little bit of Tyreek Hill, Waddle vibes. If you listen to our first episode, Ben, you talked about like we don't care exactly like who's wide receiver one or not.
Yep.
And here, you've got AJ Brown for 268 PPR points, Devonta Smith for 242. We've got a very similar ratio, 252 for AJ Brown, 225 for Devonta. Part of me even wants to slide, a little bit more Devonta's way. We've got a 10 target gap in favor of AJ Brown. There were they were really tight in targets over the duration of the season. So I don't have a lot of AJ Brown in my early drafts. He's going so early. I really do like him, but he's going so early, and I end up with a decent amount of Devonta Smith where I'm like 2-3 turn, give me that, over a running back at that point in time. But both these guys, I think, are like, they're going to produce for fantasy. It's going to be concentrated. It's going to be efficient.
Yep. Completely agree. And I like Goddard. Same deal. I think it's going to concentrate on him too. He's the one that's like a more palatable price, right? Honestly, but I still will take some AJ Brown and some Devonta Smith. I'm not like out on these guys.
Yeah, it's just
I do think it's going to concentrate, like you said.
The any like round 18 Quez Watkins.
I love Quez, but just because of what I was saying with the RPOs and stuff, I mean, it's tough. Like he didn't get a lot of work. I could see throwing him on the backs of stacks. I've thought about it. I have not pulled that trigger a ton, but it is something to think about.
You mentioned Goddard as the easiest price tag. One of the few season-long prop bets we put out so far. We rarely take overs in the season-long prop market, but we did take over 600.5 receiving yards on Goddard. Tight end injuries are definitely higher than other positions, but Goddard, we've got for 92 targets. You've got for 100 targets. We've got him, somewhere between 800, 900 receiving yards. Just seems really solid with the concentration in this offense. Like, he's a lot of times these tight ends in this range are like really risky, but I think this year, like Goddard and Waller might not be quite as risky as sometimes some of the tight ends that in the past that have gotten pushed up in this range.
Agreed. Yeah, I like this middle round of tight ends, late single digit round, a lot more this year than we have had in the last few years.
Let's go to Washington and a team that's really tough to project. Play calling, we basically have them around league average plays per game, 63.5. We both have them right around a 58% pass rate. When everything's netted in the end, we have 31.9 pass attempts per game, 29 rush attempts per game. You're slightly lower on pass attempts, slightly higher on rush attempts. Part of that is like maybe scramble rate, I think. But they're difficult, Ben, for a few reasons. One, the quarterback, we don't know exactly who it's going to be. It looks like it's probably going to be Howell. Two, we have a new coordinator switch. We have Bieniemy coming over, which could be like a really big change for them. And then even if you look at their offense last year, it was kind of a tale of two halves based on what was happening. At times they were a little bit pass happy and high pace out of the gate. Towards the end of the season, they were a little bit more run heavy. And I'm going to pull up those exact numbers here. But in terms of PROE, like the last from week 10 on, they were basically double-digit PROE, in double-digit negative PROE every week, whereas earlier in the season, they're a little bit pass happier. So, and all that might be totally irrelevant with Bieniemy coming over and a new quarterback. So difficult to parse.
Definitely. And if it is Howell, I mean, they could be slow for that reason, just because he's a young quarterback. It's tough. They did run a decent number of plays. I go back to a year Rivera was in Carolina when Kyle Allen was the quarterback, and they were like a 4-12 team, I think, but they were top 5 in play volume that year too. Rivera has led a couple of these offenses that have played a little faster. I don't know that he's probably more of a conservative coach. Like we joke about the Riverboat Ron name, like he's a lot more conservative than that nickname would imply, but he has had a couple of like sort of bad teams that have been somewhat interesting for fantasy over his head coaching career that have at least given me hope about this team. Sam Howell is a guy that I like. Sean Siegel, my co-host on Stealing Bananas, likes. We've talked about him a lot over there. He's a guy that was a really highly touted quarterback prospect out of high school, good quarterback, and basically a straight quarterback, passing quarterback as a freshman and sophomore at UNC. And then his junior year, he loses Javonte Williams, Michael Carter, De'Ami Brown to the NFL. And his passing numbers come down a little bit, but he also runs this year for 800 yards and 11 touchdowns all of a sudden. First 2 seasons, he had like under 200 yards rushing combined, but he becomes this scrambling quarterback and shows that he can win multiple ways. And it was kind of confusing why he fell as far as he did in the NFL draft. He falls to the early 5th. We don't know how committed Washington is. Early in the offseason, they talked a lot about playing him. More recent comments have implied that they might be willing to play Jacoby Brissett. I don't know where they're going to go on that. But I do think the offense has more upside with Howell. Brissett was good with the Browns last year, but if you go back and look through the rest of his career, that was his best career season. He's been on 4 different teams in the last 4 seasons now. He's basically bounced around. He was with Miami the year before. He was with Indy prior to that. Now he's here in Washington. He has never started for the same team 2 years in a row. When he started sometimes in Indy, they found different answers the next year. Teams that he's even played well for have tended to ship him off. He looks like a backup quarterback who had a decent year with the Browns last year. I don't think he's going to elevate the ceiling of this offense. Howell's the one that I think gives you a little bit of hope. But yeah, it's a tough offense to predict and figure out what's going to happen.
Yeah. And, how we see the uncertainty. One of the biggest discrepancies in our projections is like the efficiency on Howell. We have him at a 59% completion rate right now, 6.5 yards per attempt. You're a little bit higher on both completion percentage and yards per attempt, and how that shakes out. And, that funnels through to the projections for everybody. So it'll be interesting. Howell seems like a decent late round upside bet, but
the mobility could be key for him if he does play.
Yeah. So you can see where he has legitimate upside for a late round quarterback bet. At the same time, like sometimes it's hard to make late round quarterback bets on guys that like you don't know for sure are going to be the starter. Sure. Right? It's just like, Corain's talked about that too. Like, is that just a losing battle in general if you just avoided all those guys? And I don't know. I've taken some Howell though, but yeah, going to the running back position. This is the year I get even on Antonio Gibson. I feel it. Gibson's been one of my favorite picks this year. I think early on, in particular, the draft season, the Washington running backs as a whole were just undervalued, with people kind of anchoring to the ranks they had prior to the NFL draft and after, and they just didn't do a lot. They brought in Chris Rodriguez, a rookie, and he might get some play. It's a new coaching staff. They brought him on, but just listening to some of the things they've said early on, I feel good about Gibson. I think Robinson, we've both got Robinson for over 200 carries. So we think he's going to carry the rock. It's just, he was extremely inefficient as a rusher last year. We don't have him for a lot of targets. I think he's okay where he goes in drafts, but it's not like, that's typically not the bet that you're trying to make, right? You kind of want
205 carries, 12 targets last year. I mean, that's just a run heavy. And you mentioned inefficient as a runner on top of it.
Yeah. We want either efficiency upside. So think Rashad Penny in the ground game, or we want target upside. And he doesn't really have either right now. I guess the hope would just be that, the efficiency's volatile and it comes back, but I prefer Gibson right now, especially in a full PPR format.
Yeah, I mean, the other case maybe would be without McKissick there, that some of the targets shift back to Robinson from last year. But the way I'm looking at it is there's no real case for a second receiving running back. Chris Rodriguez is the third running back. It looks like he's a bigger back, very limited college receiving profile. It looks like Gibson's going to have most of the running back routes to himself. Last year when he lost sort of the early down work to Robinson, what that meant was they actually had him like splitting out wide a little bit, running some routes down the field. He made some nice plays too. He played some receiver in college. I kind of like that for him, especially if Robinson's just going to be taking a lot of the low value touches and kind of inefficient plotting runs. And Gibson over time could potentially take more of the rushing as well if he's making some explosive plays, and it just becomes kind of clear throughout the year that he has more explosiveness to his game, which if you look at their athletic profiles kind of feels like the reality of it. So I'm right with you, man. I have not taken Robinson. I take a decent amount of Gibson. That's the way that I want to play this bet.
Wide receiver, we've each got Terry McLaurin around 120 targets and about 200 PPR points per game. We're pretty close on Jahan Dotson too, around 100 targets and about 170 PPR points total. Sorry, I think I said per game. I meant total. That would be a record. 200 points per game. That would be a record. 200 total PPR points. And then for Dotson, around 170 total PPR points. I was drafting these guys heavily early. I did get a little scared. I think I'm a little more squeamish on Howell at quarterback than you are in terms of the passing efficiency. But McLaurin's definitely in a spot of drafts right now where it's like, I don't know. The drop off from him is then you've got like Chris Godwin, Marquise Brown, and there's like, basically, are you taking McLaurin or are you taking a running back kind of at that point in drafts? And I've opted for McLaurin a decent bit. Dotson, is someone I want to get your take on for sure, because you're, really good with the young wide receiver profiles and parsing that out. And sophomore wide receivers are often really strong bets. I was kind of hot on him to start. He had a weird season. It's hard to divvy up the yards per route run, but it did seem like that improved towards the latter half of the season when he returned from, a short absence in the middle of the year.
Yeah. So he wasn't in a great full season TPRR range, but like if you look at his game log, he had a really quiet stretch after he missed 5 games. He caught just 2 balls on 4 targets over 3 games after he came back from injury. And he was playing decent snaps in each, but like it's just a weird little blip in his game log. When you look at the rest of his profile, I feel like I can caveat the negatives. His route sample isn't huge. So like I'm not that concerned about his targets per route run not being like amazing. He was very efficient, which is important. Like after earning the volume, he was efficient yards per target. He scored a bunch of touchdowns for his target level. His touchdown rate was very high. And then he closed the season well, which is typically a really great sign. It was just that weird little, mid-season stretch. So I'm in. And one of the things I would say about this past game, and one of the reasons that like getting Sam Howell right is kind of important, is this is another one that feels very concentrated. The guy that they usually use as sort of a 4th receiver the last couple of years was Cam Sims. He's gone now. De'Ami Brown has not really been able to crack the rotation here. He's their 4th receiver now. I don't think this looks like a team that could get really concentrated with their routes. I even think at tight end, Logan Thomas, who I haven't really taken, but if he can consolidate the routes and stay healthy, he hasn't been able to stay healthy really the last couple of years, but they didn't add anything else at tight end. They still have John Bates and Cole Turner behind him. Like it could be the same sort of 11 personnel on every single route that we see in some offenses. It reminds me a little bit of Jacksonville last year, where they had basically Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, Evan Ingram running like every route. And then those guys had some random spike weeks, but they weren't all very consistent, but they all ended up pretty productive at their costs. Now, the big part of that was that Trevor Lawrence overperformed, relative to the year prior that he played at. You need Howell to be good, and you need the offense to elevate. But the routes could really concentrate here in a way that I would be excited. I like Dotson's profile a lot. I haven't taken McLaurin a lot in his career, but he's another one for the reasons you said in that range. I've definitely taken a few times. And then Curtis Samuel is the third guy that I think late, as cheap as he is, he's a great bet for this year's Zay Jones. Like he's going to run a lot of routes, and if they're a better passing offense than the market expects, he can end up having some exciting moments. He's been good at times. Curtis Samuel was a little bit buzzier last year and actually had a decent start to the season, got a little banged up mid-season. But yeah, I think those 3 receivers are going to run like all the routes. That's what they basically did last year, and there's not really a case for any other receiver to cut into that.
Yeah, I like that call. We're like, Samuel is definitely one of the late wide receivers we're furthest ahead of ADP on. Tight end, I haven't drafted any Logan Thomas just because, kind of age durability concerns. But from a role perspective, it makes sense. What you're saying. You've got him for 69 targets. Nice. We've got him for 59. But I have not drafted Logan Thomas yet. He would be.
I don't think I have either, as much as I talk about it.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I think that wraps it up for the NFC East. We'll be releasing these podcasts as we record them. So you should have the AFC East, NFC East out there. And yeah, really looking forward to the rest of this series. Ben, anything you want to say before we get out of here?
No, these are 2 fun divisions to kick out of the gate. Again, the East divisions are fun this year. So it'll be fun to get into the rest of them, but hopefully we did these 2 divisions justice, because there's a lot of interesting storylines here.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, check out Ben on Twitter at yardspergretch. His Substack's bengretch.substack.com. You can find all my stuff on Establish the Run. And if you're watching this on the Establish the Run YouTube channel, subscribe, give us a thumbs up. Or if you're listening to this on iTunes, rate and review. Helps me to continue doing these podcasts for free. Appreciate y'all tuning in.